Our topic is environmental management systems, and I want together with you now to explore in brief what makes an environmental management system, what does the standard ISO 14001 tell us, because this is the main standard which we are using as a basis. And then what are, from our experience, the most important key elements, and we will start to explore this then. This is our program for today. We start with this introduction. What is the structure of an environmental management system? How is it built to support continuous improvement? What is the link, as I have started to explain, to resource efficiency and cleaner production? And what are benefits, success factors, and so on. We will continue immediately then with the first four elements, which we think are really important to understand because they nicely show us the logic and they are the key success factors at the same time, which is stakeholder analysis, so to understand who has an interest in our organization, to understand the context the organization is working in, and this starts from the clients. This involves our employees, but this reaches out to authorities, for an example, very well. And then we will briefly discuss two key elements which we already know from resource efficient and cleaner production, which is an environmental policy and the team as a working entity in the company. We will continue immediately applying this in an exercise. I will tell you more about the mode of the exercises in a minute. We will discuss what we have found out in the exercise, and after this we will continue following the same scheme now on the next key element, which is understanding environmental aspects, evaluating them, applying risk management considerations, talking about compliance and how we derive objectives and an action plan. That's basically the program for today, for this afternoon. Let's start. What is this animal? What is environmental management? What does the standard tell us, as I have explained already a little bit? What is the starting point? Starting point is environmental impact. Global population, consumption, production, which is there to provide products to satisfy our needs, our requirements, leaves an environmental footprint. And by applying environmentally friendly products and technologies, we can reduce it. The impact of humans on the environment is big. On the one hand side, we consume more and more resources, and not going into this, but we all know that some of them have a very limited outreach, and this is not only exotic minerals, this is very commonly used materials like zinc, copper, which is not available forever, but only for just one more generation if we continue like this. And we see the impact of waste that we generate. And basically, the idea of environmental management now is to have an answer to this, to develop an organized approach how to understand the impacts our industries have and what is the best combination of efforts to reduce the impact with reasonable effort, to put it into a nutshell. I will come back to this in a minute. These key issues, also in our group, we need not analyze the details. We know that population is growing. We know there is an increasing demand for food, for water, for other natural resources. There is a competition for these resources, and climate is changing. These are just a few observations. And to focus now on our topic of today, an environmental management system is now for industries, for other organizations, a way to firstly understand what are significant impacts of our activities, and secondly, how to address them effectively and efficiently. So that we put this hierarchy of prevention, minimization of waste, recycling, utilization of waste into a systematic, continuous process. That's it basically. We want to understand our environmental impact. We want to understand where we have the best leverage in reducing this impact, and we want to put this into a systematic activity so that we, from the point of view of an organization, do not waste resources in running errands, but that we are working on things which really matter. That's it basically in a nutshell. Now, to illustrate this better, let's do a small mental exercise. It's a little bit difficult on the screen. This is usually better done on a flip chart, but let's try it with the means we have. In the picture here, you see a model of an organization. This box represents an organization, and these circles represent individual members of this organization, which all want to do something good for the environment. And these arrows symbolize the effort these people are taking, basically. Now I have a question to the engineers among us. If these circles are people, and if these arrows are symbolizing the force which they can exact, into which direction is this organization, is this system moving? I'm sure we all can add up these forces. If I take this force working in this direction, if I add then the effort of my colleague, who is also doing his best, but he's working on a completely different thing with different priorities. And if I add now the effort of this person, effort of the one on top, effort of the colleague here, effort then of these two, what is the overall force which is moving my organization? It adds up to a force like this. All these people, all these 2, 4, 6, 7 people are working as hard as they can, but the whole system is hardly moving, because some of the activities they do work against each other, they are not really coordinated just to describe this model. Now, let's look at this case. It's the same organization, it's the same people, but now the common vision and the management system is sort of organizing their efforts. And all of them do not work more or fundamentally different, but all of them just work more or less into the same direction. What is now the impact of their activities? Again, we are adding up forces, and now, strangely, nobody is working much more, nobody is putting much more effort, but the whole system is moving. And this is basically what we are talking about today, how to build this shared vision and how to develop an organized system to organize all the elements of an organization into the direction which the environmental policy provides. That's in a nutshell the function of an environmental management system. The basic framework comes from quality management. You probably remember this gentleman called Deming, who worked with Toyota in the late 1950s and 1960s, and he developed this management cycle, this management approach of plan, do, check, act as a basis for continuous improvement. And ISO 14000 or environmental management applies this plan, do, check, act cycle to improve environmental performance. These 4 steps follow each other like a wheel continuously. Planning means to define the environmental policy, identifying environmental aspects, establishing objectives. Do means to implement, actually. This includes training and operational controls. Check means auditing in an annual cycle to check how things are going. And act means a review process in which management decides whether the process is fine or not, or whether adjustments have to be done. This is basically the picture. This plan, do, check, act cycle shall improve environmental quality, and the application of the standard, the application of these elements is like applying a wedge which prevents from the wheel of the organization to roll back on this slope. So the standard defines a system which is better and which becomes better and better, and which provides for a stable continuous improvement process. What is in this context ISO 14000? It's an international standard. You will find it on the SharePoint in a version which is strictly for organizational purposes. So unfortunately, this cannot be shared, but for your information, there is a version of this standard there. The target is to enable an organization to develop, implement a policy, and out of these policy objectives, and to inform about significant environmental aspects, and to develop systematic action to mitigate these significant environmental aspects. What is the benefit of having one ISO 14000 standard? It's a blueprint, it's a template, it defines the elements of an effective environmental management system, and it doesn't leave it to our interpretation what we should do, what we could do, what is maybe working, what not. It tells us the elements. These elements are basically arranged like a pyramid. On top is the environmental policy, which is basically the environmental constitution of an organization. It shows briefly in a page what do we consider our key environmental aspects and what are we going to do about it. How are we going to work on continuous improvement, legal compliance, how are we involving our employees in a nutshell. And as a result, as a support for the implementation of this environmental policy, next in the environmental management system, we have a layer of organizational structure, because that's what we need to implement the policy. We need to have representatives from different departments working in a coordinated way, like in our example. We talked about the policy, the responsibilities, organizational structure, procedures to organize interaction of key people, operational procedures for areas with environmental impact, and records. Records can mean checklists, can mean measurements, can mean key performance indicators to prove that we are actually implementing the system, but also that we are moving towards our objectives. But this we will discuss later again. This is in your materials also, because I think Nune asked this and a few other people asked for this also. What is a plan how to build all these elements? What is a sequence of activities, and which outputs do we need to produce when building an environmental management system? And this is this sequence. We start with management commitment. We will explore in a minute why this is so important. We design the project leading to a project plan, which basically outlines who will do what in the process of installing an environmental management system. We need to install a team. We need a policy. We need to evaluate environmental aspects, stakeholders, and the context. And this will result then to objectives and the program. All this we will discuss step by step. We will define this layer of procedures, which leads to the documents, like the manual, like the procedures. A key step is to familiarize people in our organization with these procedures. This is probably a training program. Then the system will have to prove its value for a while until we can audit it, which means actually we will check whether it's effective and efficient. Also, this auditing we will discuss tomorrow in the morning. The final conclusion then after the review by management is the external audit, in case we want a certified management system where an external auditor like Sergey comes into the organization checks whether it's conforming with the ISO 14000 standard, provides a report and most probably a certificate. This is the procedure in a nutshell. The steps which I outlined and which I marked on the chart are the key steps which we are exploring. This is what is called the high-level structure of integrated management systems. This tells us that basically standards targeting environmental management, targeting energy, or targeting quality have the same structure at the center. These policies, objectives, program, documentation, review, communication is basically the same in all these management standards, and just the technical focus is different. Obviously, in environmental management, it's on understanding environmental aspects of an organization and on reducing them. In energy management, it's on improving energy performance. And in quality management, it's more, of course, on the quality of products, on the service, on how we deliver against the contracts which we have with the clients. So how is resource efficient and cleaner production now linked to this? Basically, the elements of assessing input materials, waste, emissions are more or less the same. Tools which we explored in resource efficient and cleaner production, like this input-output analysis, or flow charting, or waste maps, work perfectly well in environmental management as well. And actually, you could say an environmental management system is an extension of an RECP program in the respect that it provides for continuation of RECP. It's actually providing the basis for continuous application of RECP to systematically not only improve once by identifying some measures, but to continue this process over the years and step by step identifying new measures, implementing new measures, simply improving our environmental impact. What is the benefit of such an organized approach? We integrate environmental issues into business management, which on the one hand side provides a competitive advantage because we reduce waste emissions. By this we reduce cost. And on the other side, we are one step ahead by doing so, because we are able to identify problems early before they really impact on our organization, and we develop an organized approach to reduce them systematically. At the same time, this is risk management. Also in the aspect that we talk more to our suppliers, asking them to apply the same standards, and cleaner suppliers which generate less waste, less emissions, are on a long-term perspective the more reliable suppliers. We could explore this in more details. Let's leave it like that for the moment. The first topic, which is covered in the standard, which we have to deal with, is commitment of top management. Obviously, this is a key element of an effective environmental management system. Top management must be convinced, because management must demonstrate leadership, must demonstrate commitment. This is building the basis as an essential success factor for implementation. Because management must lead by example, on the one hand side, to be convincing, and on the other side, they must release the resources which a management system needs. People are involved, time is taken, some resources will be needed maybe to do measurements and so on. So top management must be committed, ideally from day one of an environmental management system. What are their responsibilities? Basically, the key issue is that management takes responsibility for environmental aspects of the organization and acts accordingly. By having an environmental policy, by establishing environmental objectives, by integrating all the elements which we have just discussed into the management system, into the business process, they build the basis for an effective system. Also, there will not be effective communication if management is not backing up the environmental management system, and it will simply not be convincing and not motivating for employees if there is no clear support by top management. So to summarize this part, what are the first steps to do when building an environmental management system? Entry point is to get commitment from management, explaining, getting the support. Second step, a project plan, like the outline which we have briefly discussed earlier, so that it's clear what is the timeline, what are the resources needed. Regarding resources, we will have a few tables from our experience in the end of tomorrow's presentation to get a better view of how much effort it, from our experience, usually on average takes to implement all these stages, and to present and agree a project plan with the top management, so that the whole procedure of implementing the management system is agreed upon with the management, so that the support of management is secured and clearly communicated to everybody involved in the next steps. And what are these next steps? To build the basis for the environmental management system, we have the team, we have a policy, and we have a stakeholder analysis, and we will discuss these elements now in more details. Why do we establish an environmental team? This probably sounds a stupid question for everybody who has experienced an RECP program or who has participated in an RECP club, because it's sort of evident that work on, let's say, very broad problems or very integrated, very complex issues, like improving the environmental aspects of an organization, requires the knowledge of more than an individual. Different parts of the organization will be involved, from purchasing, accounting, stock keeping, production, sales, marketing, maintenance. All of them will be involved at some point, giving their experience, giving their opinions, formulating ideas. All will be involved then in the implementation procedures when improving good housekeeping options, when defining purchasing criteria, when organizing, optimizing production maybe. So the identification of options, the evaluation and the implementation of options to improve environmental aspects will require contributions from different parts of the organization. And these parts range from top management to maintenance, to product development, to production. Not all of these parts of the organization will be permanent members of the environmental team. Probably it will be a core team, small core team, 3, 4, 5 people who promote the activities, who focus, who have a focus on the environment. And at times, depending on the problems, depending on the issues, there are more people from the organization can join temporarily. This is what we define when we describe the environmental team. Basically, we identify key people which we need on the team and people who will support them. This will be our first exercise for one group, for a case study company, which I'm going to present in a minute, to identify members for an environmental team and to describe a little bit what we expect from them. So, first activity or first element of environmental management is to form an environmental team. To elaborate a little bit more on the benefits of teamwork, you probably all know what team stands for. Together, everyone achieves more. In German, we have different interpretations, very practical ones. I will translate in a minute. Toll, ein anderer macht's. Doesn't fit to the letters, but the German translation is great. Another person is responsible, and I don't have to care. But this is clearly not the idea of teamwork. In a team, you can achieve more than an individual. The size of the team, of course, should match the size and the complexity of an enterprise. It will be very structured, involving lots of people in a big multinational company, and it will consist of maybe 3, 4 people in a small one. Working together usually motivates, because people, by interacting, motivate each other. It also provides continuity, because probability is low that always all people have a bad day. So the ones who are motivated, the ones who are active, can maybe drag the other ones a little bit. And of course, in order not to consume too much resources. There will be a mix of permanent members from critical departments, from departments which are responsible for most of our environmental impact, and then there will be temporary members depending on the focus of our activities, so supporting the permanent members. So the team was the first element. The second element is stakeholders, is context of the organization. Now, if we look at the graph here, we have in the center this plan, do, check, act cycle. And what this graph wants to show is that the organization always acts within a context of interested parties. These are our stakeholders, which might have an interest in the organization and which might interact or who will interact with our organization and raise internal and external issues which we need to consider. And this is part of our of the next step of understanding the context of the organization, to describe interested parties, the stakeholders that are relevant to us, and to describe or to identify in the first place the external and internal issues that are relevant for us, which result basically from needs and expectations from people outside the organization, outside and inside the organization. We should not have a clear delimitation between inside and outside, because in this process we typically also consider employees, because employees will have human requirements. They need safe job, they need to be proud of the enterprise, need to communicate with their families, and so on and so on. So these limits are not so strict. It's interested parties in general who has an interest in our organization. These people, these parties, we want to identify when we analyze the context of our organization, and we want to understand the nature of interacting with them. What requirements are there? What expectations are there? And if we think about our clients also, what is the interest of the client? What does he or she need our product for? And how should we interact in order to have a stable long-term relation to these interested parties? Regarding the process of identification of stakeholders, as a starting point, there will be many. So the first question is, which are the relevant stakeholders? Which are the stakeholders whom we think or for whom we have experience that they interact with our organization, and what are their needs, and which of their needs become requirements, become obligations for our company, for our enterprise. This we want to understand in this stakeholder analysis, because clearly as a consequence, all these requirements, all these obligations can include, on the one hand side, risks. Talking about authorities, if we have a permit, if there are clear requirements in the permit, and if we violate these, we better not, because on the long term it might be a problem. On the other side, this might also contain opportunities, like the need of the client. If we think then about our case study company, the chocolate company, the need of the client is something sweet, yes, but the need is also to find something which is unique, which the client can use towards third persons to impress them or simply to congratulate them, talking about chocolate for a birthday. So if we understand this, we maybe can redesign our product so that it fits the client better and that we can have unique sales propositions which we identify in this process of identification of stakeholders. This also will be, after this session, will be an exercise. One group is working on a stakeholder analysis for our case study enterprise. So what are the elements? Identify the stakeholders, can be a lot of different parties. Briefly assess them, what is the impact the stakeholders have on us, on our enterprise. And then finally, and there are already some suggestions on the whiteboard you will be working on, what could be strategies, how to involve them, how to deal with these stakeholders. Because focusing now on the environment, the expectations of the stakeholders towards how we should act towards the environment definitely will require certain strategies from us as an enterprise. This is a brief example for how strategies towards stakeholders could look like. This is clearly not our chocolate manufacturing company, but this is a steel mill. They identified customers, neighbors, suppliers, employees, bank owners as key stakeholders who have an interest in the organization and the environmental performance of the organization. And the result of their assessment, steel mill, was we have one stakeholder with a high interest in us and high power upon us, which is the bank. And for stakeholders with high power and high interest, the appropriate strategy is to manage them closely. Manage them closely means to inform them actively, to make suggestions, to be very transparent towards them. The employees by the steel mill were considered as somebody with a high power, but not so much interest in the environmental performance of the organization. The steel mill will know why they had this assessment. So the appropriate strategy in this case is to keep employees satisfied, which means in this context not to do anything violating regulations, to comply with health and safety procedures, to reduce exposure to chemicals and so on, but not more. And two more strategies for the area of stakeholders with high interest and low power, just to inform them regularly, which is a milder version of manage closely, and stakeholders with low power and low interest in the organization, in the environmental performance of the organization will be monitored. We will talk to them, we will provide an environmental report on our webpage so that they can look into it if they're interested, but not much more. This is the purpose of the stakeholder analysis in a nutshell, to identify mainly stakeholders with a high interest and high power, and to identify what should be the strategy towards them, now mostly focusing on our environmental performance and on the actions we take to improve it. Last but not least, in this session, the environmental policy, which is the starting point for the environmental management, which stands at the top of the pyramid of the management system, and which has the role of an environmental constitution. It's a reference document for the whole organization, but also for stakeholders from outside, to provide a clear picture of what the organization thinks about the environment. What are the requirements towards the environmental policy? Because it should be a really strong paper. It should be like a portrait. It should be concise. The environmental policy needs to be appropriate to the purpose and context of an organization. That means it should have a fingerprint, which means obviously that the environmental policy of a bank cannot be the same like in a steel mill, because it needs to refer to the context of the organization, to its main processes, products, to its significant environmental impacts. The environmental policy needs to provide a framework for setting environmental objectives. So the basic objectives then for the organization should flow out of the environmental policy. This needs to be consistent. This should be a red thread. So there needs to be a connection then between environmental objectives, so the framework of objectives and targets. And this framework is the environmental policy. The environmental policy needs to include a commitment to the protection of the environment. And this includes now basically RECP. It includes prevention of pollution and specific commitments regarding the organization, like, for example, compliance. Legal compliance is one of the commitments that are required, and a commitment to continual improvement. So these are the key aspects an environmental policy should have. These are the key contents elements of an environmental policy. It needs to be maintained, because maybe it will change over the years. When the company grows, the priorities might shift. When it starts new activities, new business activities, it probably will have to be adapted. So it needs to be maintained. It needs to be communicated, and it needs to be available to interested parties. So it should be available on the internet or in a printed version, or at the gate with the receptionist. The second point, from my experience, I find very important, and this is linking to the picture which is in this slide. The policy needs to be communicated as it is the reference document, as it is the environmental constitution inside the company, amongst the employees. And it needs to be shown that this is a serious document, that it really stands for the will of management, that it's part of the strategy of the company. And for me, this was very nicely symbolized in the environmental policy, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide, because this is the policy actually of a steel manufacturing company here in Austria. And they developed it in a one-day workshop where key people were represented. The environmental team was there, but also top management was there. And as a result, they wrote down the key phrases which comply with what we have just discussed. So what does the company stand for? We are leading global technology company. We understand our environmental impact. We want to reduce it, and so on. Written in handwriting and finally signed by all the participants of this meeting. And the picture of this is then put in the boardroom with the receptionist and in the plant control room as a constant reminder of what environmental values the company believes in, what this policy is, and also as a statement of commitment of all the people who were involved in the process of developing it to follow up according to what was identified during that meeting. So the policy is not just a piece of paper which can go to a drawer for the next audit or whatever, but the policy actually, ideally, is an active document which represents the philosophy of the company and which is a clear statement towards the active implementation of environmental management. So this environmental policy document is a serious document, and that's why we discuss it in the very beginning, talking about environmental management. So first step was creating buying in of the management, generating management commitment. The second step now to do is to collect an environmental team, which means to define responsibilities and implement the team. Then to identify stakeholders, assess the interrelations with stakeholders, considering, of course, environmental aspects in the first place, and defining the strategy, how we want to communicate with stakeholders. And then the key step of this set of activities, the definition of a honest, serious, motivating environmental policy as a basis for further communication on the environmental management system inside of the company and also outside. So this is basically what we will do in group work. Let me introduce the company which is the topic of our case study. I discussed the other day, one or the other of you knows this company or has even visited it. This company has been working now for a little bit more than 20 years, 25 years. And it has become an icon of Austria. Zotter, the brand, is one of the globally 10 best known brands of Austria in the meantime. And it's all about chocolate. It's a small company, it's growing. It has less than 100 employees, 50, 60 employees at the moment. And you see the general manager in this picture here. And what we can take from this picture is he's serious about chocolate. He knows everything about chocolate, from the beans which he buys in Guatemala and in Africa, to the clients which are invited to cooperate in designing new products, new presentations. Maybe you can see it in the camera. I've here a variety of his products. These are the bars in the usual presentation he sells. Very interesting tastes. This is a chocolate bar, dark chocolate with chili. This is a different one, is strawberry, but he calls it First Aid. And this is a flowery design with garden flowers. It also tastes like garden flowers. Sorry that we cannot share these products with you for tasting. That's a drawback of these virtual seminars. But to make this long story short, this is the second message of this picture. You cannot beat the creativity about chocolate of this company. They have hundreds of tastes. They constantly change their tastes. They produce chocolate from beans to bar. I will explain in a minute. Just briefly, in the materials which we distributed yesterday, you have a brief description of the company, of its background, of its clients. In the first 4 or 5 pages, then the rest of the document is all these elements which we will be discussing. Now, let me introduce this company in more details. I said beans to bars, so the company really starts from cocoa. Mr. Zotter visits all his suppliers. He knows most of them, I guess. Personally, he interacts with them. He communicates with them about, in German, bio, which is organic, growing organic agriculture. This is very important for him. For this, he pays a premium. So fair trade for Zotter is not a gray idea, but they really do it. They overpay market pricing significantly in order to get very good quality, top quality of cocoa. So it's organic, fair traded, and green. This is the credo of the company. We are now inside the production building, which you saw in the first slide. Cocoa beans are delivered. They have to be cleaned from fibers, from stones and so on. Then they are roasted. It's a big roaster where at about 100, 120 degrees, the beans are toasted so that they develop their aroma. Then the beans are crushed. The husk is separated. The husk is given to farmers then for compostation. The central part, the heart of the bean, is pressed to separate the cocoa powder from the fat. This step is important because the fat then is partly again mixed to the chocolate according to the recipe. How this separation is done is easy. It's just hydraulic pressing. The recipe, how much then is mixed and what is added and so on, is very sophisticated. And this is something which is not disclosed, what they actually add. All of this is organic. Some sugar, some milk from local farms, and so on and so on. So after pressing, after separating the fat from the cocoa powder then is mixed according to the recipes. Then there is this process which is called conching, which is basically moving around the mass for a while in dedicated machines. And when the chocolate is ready, and it really quality control looks like you see in the central picture here, when the texture, when the color, when the smell is right, then it's spread out on tables, because the actual manufacturing of the chocolate bar is done manually. So it's spread out on tables. The fillings are added manually, and then the cover is applied. That's it basically. After this comes packaging, and then the labels are applied, and then the chocolate is ready for selling.
As we started discussing initially, an environmental management system is about continuous improvement of environmental aspects of to improve, we need to have a baseline. We need to understand our environmental aspects, the environmental aspects of a company. We need to understand obligations, and out of this evaluation, we will draw objectives and a plan how to improve. Now, issues, there are plenty. Basically, we are talking with about all the aspects of production, which is air pollution, water pollution, which is waste, which is the use of hazardous substances, and so on. And our task at this point is to find out what are the environmental aspects which are relevant, and which of these we can control, and how we are going to do about that. And in this process, we have to consider, of course, new developments, new technologies, modification of our activities, new product developments, abnormal conditions also, not only business as usual, but also emergency situations. So, no, my camera is on. Okay, I will just do this brief presentation. We have to be clear about what is an aspect, which is everything in a company that interacts with the environment, and what is an impact, which is a change to the environment, pollution, waste, and so on, resulting from the environmental aspects of an organization. How do aspects look like? Basically, they can be everything, like we see in the right picture. Ideally, we should consider the product life cycle, so all the environmental aspects which are induced also by the raw materials, by the production, by the use of our products, and by the disposal. We need to be careful what an aspect is and to keep it apart from objectives, because improved air quality is not an aspect. The air emissions are the aspect, and the objective would be to improve air quality. Water pollution, on the other side, is an impact. So thinking about the picture of the product life cycle, we talk about direct, indirect aspects. Indirect aspects being the raw materials we have discussed for ZOTA, product use, energy use, fuel usage. What are aspects, indirect aspects in the supply chain during the preparation of the raw materials which we are using. We definitely need to consider also emergency situations, so accidents, releases, problems which might be caused by waste which is not managed properly. So not only the normal situation, but also the emergency situation. An example here is a boiler. Environmental aspects of a boiler would be consumes water, consumes fuel, has emissions to the air, and the corresponding impacts to water consumption would be it depletes the regional water table, it depletes natural resources in terms of fuel, or it pollutes the air regionally. We're talking about these environmental aspects. We are talking about obligations which we are facing from compliance. And we're talking about other requirements identified that need to be addressed. Other requirements can result, for example, from our clients or from the neighbors or from standards which are important in the supply chain we are part of. So these environmental aspects, other requirements, and compliance is what we have to consider when we evaluate environmental aspects. Let me skip this one. Where do we find now the information we need in order to be able to assess environmental aspects, to identify potential impacts, and to evaluate these? We have process flow diagrams. We can talk to people who are on a daily basis experiencing the situations, like supervisors, staff operators. We have inventories. We have records, accident reports, emergency incidents. We have consumption records, and we maybe have measurements which we can analyze. What is the procedure? We evaluate quantities. This is input-output analysis. We know what comes into the company. We know what leaves the company. This is part of an RECP assessment. This was done in the RECP clubs. We evaluate the aspects according to defined criteria. I will show you an example in a minute. And then we record, communicate the results, derive appropriate objectives, and develop a plan. This is an example how such an evaluation can look like. We see here in the left matrix some areas. This list would be much longer. You have it in the materials describing ZOTA. And then we have here, environmental aspects resulting to impacts. And according to the scheme on the right-hand side, we rate these impacts connected to the environmental aspects from the respective process areas, process units of the company. And the criteria which we apply are organized like a traffic light scheme. This is a very simple example. We use it a lot. In some cases, it's too easy, too straightforward, and needs to be a bit more detailed. But for most applications, we have found this very useful. Which would mean an area here stays green, and green means no further action needed, fine for the moment being, if in normal operation there are no toxic materials, full compliance with all legal obligations, and if losses are small. There is little wastewater, is almost no waste. Their energy intensity is not so big. This is a little bit up to the knowledge of the consultant, what is typical for the sector we are talking to evaluate these. Likewise, in an abnormal situation, in an emergency case in this area, if no accidents are known, if we do not see a risk for an accidental discharge, for a major fire, if there are effective precautionary measures in place, then this area is green, corresponding to accidents and incidents, and no further action is required. On the other side, an area would turn red if in normal operation we use toxic materials, we are not complying, we have a high loss of materials in relation to sector-specific benchmarks, or if we do not have information in relation to these criteria. No information would put this area also in the red light. And red light means measures are necessary. And measures can be organizational measures, which means that there are better regulations, better organization for this area, reducing these problems, or can be technical measures. And for the column accidents, incidents, criteria to put it into the red would be we regularly see accidents, considerable effects are possible, which means we would exceed our discharge limits, we would pollute the neighborhood, we would even put people at danger. This would mean red. Or if no information on risks and effects is available. So in principle, this is the evaluation which we suggest for average companies which are not dealing with specific, very highly polluting sectors. So simple scheme, but fit to assess the areas regarding impacts caused by environmental aspects of an industry. This is a scheme. Basically, what we are doing is to separate the green areas with minor aspects because for them there is no dedicated activity necessary apart from monitoring, from the red areas, which are significant aspects which require operational controls or objectives, targets, concrete measures to mitigate the risk resulting from this area. In this analysis, the legal compliance obligations also play into, because the organization must identify to relevant information characterizing its compliance. So in plain language, this means you need to keep a register listing all your compliance obligations. So all the laws, bylaws, permits, and so on, which contain restrictions, obligations which you have to comply with, and the status of compliance. So if in your permit it says you need to check your steam boiler once a year regarding emissions, and you have to produce a certificate from a recognized laboratory, you have to check by the end of the year whether you complied with this requirement, whether you have obtained the certificate, and whether you are meeting the emission standards you are required to. And like this, you need to have a list. I mean, can be in Excel, can be more sophisticated, where all these compliance obligations are listed, and non-compliance is an aspect you need to deal with. Out of this now, objectives and targets will result. Objectives are more general goals into which directions you want to go, and targets are detailed performance requirements. In the follow, we have an example here. So from the policy, from comparing it to the existing environmental aspects and impacts, so the legal requirements, you will take objectives and targets. And an example is, if we want to reduce waste in general as a policy commitment, an objective on a more generic level would be we reduce the waste generated in the next 3 years. And a target, a bundle of target to reach this objective would be, we want to reduce total waste by 50%. This means reducing packaging waste by 40%, reducing liquid waste, which is hydraulic oil, lubricants, and so on, by 30%, and so on. So the objective is the more generic level, and the targets are specific targets linked to activities to reach these targets. These result out of the analysis, these consider legal requirements, significant aspects, technical options, and the views of interesting parties, which means our stakeholder analysis. And all this is compiled then into an environmental program, which lists the activities, what we want to do out of our analysis, what resources are required, who will be responsible, what is the due date, and indicators whether we reach our target. These are the basic steps, and if we have done this properly, it's already 40% of the work when establishing an environmental management system. We have created the buy-in of management. We have convinced management. We have brought them aboard. They support our project. We made an environmental policy and an initial assessment. Thank you very much for the hard work in the groups. And what would be now the consecutive step is out of our analysis to define objectives, to identify any gaps or conflicts of what we have seen in terms of waste flows, in terms of numbers, in terms of efficiencies, compared to our environmental policy, to which we maybe have. And if we see such gaps, we should think about measures, can be operational measures, can be technical measures, and build them then into an environmental program. That's basically the summary of today.
Yesterday we talked about the preparations, about the organizational setup, about environmental assessment as a basis to understand the significant environmental aspects of an organization. Now we are talking about the actual organizational elements. This morning is divided into two main elements. First, we will discuss competence, which in old language was training, awareness, communication, documentation. So key elements of an environmental management system. We will do exercises again, and we cleaned out the concept boards, so today there should not be any limitations. Second part will be then the remaining key elements of an environmental management system, which is operational planning and control. So it's all these procedures governing areas of an enterprise which have a significant impact on the environment. Emergency preparedness, because not everything is normal situation. Many environmental impacts result from accidents, from mishappenings, so we need procedures for these situations. And then the final part of a management system, which is routinely evaluation, self-evaluation, internal auditing, and the management review to close the cycle, which we discussed yesterday, this plan, do, check, act cycle. Correspondingly, in an exercise in 3 groups, we will work on, in 6 groups, we will work on selection of internal auditors, internal audit plan, and the reporting of internal audits, because this actually is a really important element of continuous improvement, that we continuously analyze our gaps in the organization and maybe also technically, so that we find starting points for additional improvement. That's the plan for today. We'll try to be finished by 1. Let me jump into the first block. We will discuss the elements of documentation, competence, awareness raising, and communication, which are key elements in an environmental management, because this addresses all the internal communication on environmental aspects. This addresses training, because all the people involved who work in areas with significant environmental impacts need to know what they are expected to do. So there needs to be appropriate communication. If you remember this flowchart from yesterday, showing all the steps in the sequence we are proposing for the implementation of the environmental management, We started here with environmental commitment. We had all this discussion of what makes it attractive for a company to embark on an environmental management system. We discussed about the environmental team. We talked about the policy and environmental aspects. And now we are continuing with the establishment of a formal environmental management system, which consists of procedures, the training program, and then what is called implementation. Here means to put all the procedures into practice and to put them into operation. In blue here, I forgot probably to say yesterday, we have elements which we usually already have addressed during an RECP program. So this evaluation of environmental aspects, environmental policy, a team, we usually do within a program, within an RECP program or an RECP club. So also this training program is already touched in an RECP program. So now into details. You remember this pyramid of environmental management system documentation. On top now we have the manual. The manual really is the entry point. It gives an overview, a summary of all the interactions and procedures and obligations and documents. It's a reference document for everybody getting used to the system. We try to keep it at 20, 25 pages. I mean, of course, depends on the size and the nature of the organization. The table of context I will show you in a minute in one of the next slides. The next level, the level below the manual, the level detailing the ideas which are explained in the manual, are the environmental procedures. And the procedures now describe who is exactly doing what, when, where. So if the environmental management manual says our organization, like chocolate company, has an organized approach to understand its environmental aspects, to evaluate them annually, to compare them to obligations and own objectives, and to derive action. The corresponding procedure would now detail who exactly does what, when, in order to fulfill this element of the manual. So the procedure for environmental assessment would detail now, like Alexi described yesterday, this evaluation process. Basically, this procedure would say which data need to be ready, who will meet to discuss, who will need to come to which conclusions, which criteria will be used, and what is the resulting document to show the environmental assessment. So the procedures detail what is done in respect of the general picture the environmental manual gives us. In some areas, there will be a requirement to have even more detailed procedures, which are then called instructions, which are really like working instructions in quality management or regarding hygiene or in food processing, detailing every step of activities wherever this is required. We suggest to have this level of instructions, for example, for all the equipment which can cause environmental impact. Let me discuss the example of a boiler. In a boiler, maintenance is very important to keep the fire tubes clean, to control the lambda probe, which controls the residual oxygen. So the suggestion is for this boiler to have a clear working instruction which checks need to be done when, and who will do them, and so on. So manual, generic level, procedures to detail the activities addressed in the manual, instructions, very detailed instructions then for the areas which need them. And on the base level then we have records, checklists, reports which can act as a proof of implementation. So if a working instruction was cleaning the boiler, there would be a logbook or a checklist or so for the operator to sign, to mark that the cleaning, that the inspection was done actually, so that after a month or after 2 months, it is clear and documented that these checkups, that this maintenance, that this repair has been done. These are the 4 levels of documents, and this we are discussing now. So just to summarize and in words, we have the manual, which includes the policy, the objectives, the targets, the programs, and the basic descriptions, interaction, and activities. We have the level of environmental procedures. This is an ISO requirement, including registers of environmental aspects, compliance, obligation, and so on. We have the environmental instructions describing how activities are performed in details to manage significant environmental aspects. And we have the level of records, which will be standard forms, checklists, report formats. Now, table of contents of an environmental management system manual. This is the structure suggested by the standard. We have some flexibility to maybe combine some elements if we think this is meaningful, but basically this is the standard structure. We start with terminology. Of course, we have to explain all these phrases and terms used in the standard. We have to identify the version and the number of updates. We will describe the context of the organization. This could well be similar to what you have in your textbook on SOTA, brief description of the context of the organization. Then a description of the environmental management system, leadership, how does it work, what is the commitment of management, what is the environmental policy, what is the team, which people are involved, what are their responsibilities. Then the planning, this is basically now the identification of environmental aspects as we did it yesterday, leading to objectives. And then this part is called now support. This is what we are about to discuss. How do we guarantee our resources? How do we maintain competence? How do we make sure that all the people in the important functions know what they are doing, that this knowledge is updated and so on? Awareness, what are we doing to have an appropriate level of awareness? How does communication work? And so on. This we are going to discuss. This is our topic now for the morning session. And then this is the second session today. How do we control the operations which have a significant impact on the environment? How do we prepare for emergencies? How do we monitor our efforts, and how do we audit them at the end of the year? This is basically the structure of the manual. As I said, we tend to keep it to 25 pages, just giving the basics, how it works in the company. Now, into resources, the organization needs to identify resources needing for establishment, implementation, maintenance of the environmental management system. All what we have been discussing, starting from the evaluation of the aspects to controlling certain activities, needs resources, needs informed people, needs trained people. This chapter of the manual and probably an associated supporting procedure details how we are going to do that, which activities we do to identify the level of competence, how we check what is the level of competence of our operators, what would be the expected level of competence, what do they need to know, and how we are going to educate to train them. I will show an example for such a training plan in a minute, and this will also be part of the next exercise. Similarly, awareness raising. All of us who have worked in resource efficient and cleaner production know that the basis for good housekeeping measures is awareness about the problems associated with our daily activities. Measures are required to alert people, to make them aware of the environmental impacts of an organization, to make them aware of the consequences of their doing. This is this element. How are we identifying needs during the internal audit, in regular conversation with the employees, whatever, and what are we doing in terms of measures to increase the level of awareness? Same procedure with communication. And then, of course, this leads into documents. This runs into documents. We will discuss some of them. And we need to control the effort, the results of our effort. Whenever we do training, just to do an example here, in the end, we have to make sure that the training has been received well by the trainees, and that actually training results are there. This can be like it was in school, a brief exam, a short questioning. This also can be monitoring of actual environmental impacts related to good housekeeping, maybe. These are now the procedures. In the chart here, we have the procedures shown as these nice honeycombs, which are obligatory according to ISO 14000. We can have more. This is up to us. If we think we need to have more procedures for certain elements, it's up to us. We can combine some of these, like for example, in many cases we combine internal auditing and management review, or we combine monitoring and corrective action. ISO says these procedures must be there. And again, some of these we know already from discussing the planning phase, like the procedure, how we create and how we update an environmental policy, because updates will be necessary if something changes in the organization. Responsibilities like the team, environmental aspects like the evaluation of environmental aspects, compliance obligation. We will touch in a minute how to keep record of all the compliance obligations which might result from laws, regulations, permits, and so on. The other procedures we need to have is operational planning and control. We will discuss today competence building, communication, awareness. We have already touched a couple of times today. Documentation, obviously emergency preparedness. The elements for checking are monitoring measurement. We need to measure our relevant environmental aspects. We need to have corrective actions in case our indicators show that we are deviating from our goals, and we need to have a procedure for internal audits, for checking our management system regularly, for example, on an annual basis. And the final stage, the act in the plan to check act cycle, is the management review, where at the end of the year we evaluate the results of internal audit, the results of our indicators, the results of implemented measures, and the management review is a summary of all these findings, telling the managing director or the CEO whether everything has worked as planned and what will be the plan for the next year, or whether some actions have to be taken to bring us back onto the track of continual improvement. These are basically the necessary procedures. Again here, now as a list, I'm not repeating this, we have discussed this. Talking about documentation, documents which we use in our environmental management system need to have a certain structure, because the requirement is that all these documents identify as elements of our environmental management system. So they need to be clearly identified, for example, by a number or a clear title. And they need also other elements like the date when they are drafted, the version number, because they will be adapted and it needs to be clear what version we are talking about. Then there is usually the structure of showing what is the purpose of this procedure, of this instruction, or of this manual. What is this? Is the document applicable for the whole company, or just a process, or just an area? Which forms support the document? What are rules? Which means who does what when, whether there is a reference to a method, and which records are kept. There needs to be a history of changes, a track change mode, so that we are clear of which document we are talking, and it needs to be clearly identified who is the author, who has checked the document, and who has approved it. This is the basic structure of all elements, and to avoid any problems with maintaining updated versions of documents and so on, we usually nowadays have the rule that there is one master copy of each document in electronic form, in a certain area of the company server or whatever. And all the other printouts, circulating copies and so on, are working documents for information only. But the reference is the central document on the server to avoid any problems with different versions and different of documents. Now, control of documented information. The documented information should be available and suitable for use where it's needed. It should be adequately protected. This was the point I was raising with the one central copy on the server, and all the other copies are just for information. And the people using these copies must make sure that the copy they have complies with the master document. And of course, storage, preservation, backup, and so on, control of changes are topics to address. This picture shall just illustrate the way how an Indian company managed to control information. They simply created a huge whiteboard in the central resting area close to the canteen, and they put all the procedures, all the indicators, all the alerts or supporting information on such a huge board. And people during their spare time or when collecting food would have the opportunity of looking at this information. It's probably not really practical in our environment. We have other tools like a server, like electronic data processing, but this is the way they found. Competence awareness. We need to have a procedure which makes sure that everybody involved knows about the importance of the environmental management system, knows also about significant environmental aspects, knows about environmental benefits of his contribution or her contribution, knows about roles and responsibilities, knows whom to talk to, knows the people in the environmental team, and knows about consequences of deviation. So, for example, cleaners need to be aware of their impact on wastewater and therefore on emissions discharged with the wastewater as a basis to motivate them for compliance with the environmental management system. Procedure training needs and requirements. In this process, we should review the existing training programs because every company will have training programs anyhow regarding quality, regarding technical competencies, or regarding health and safety. Elements of these training plans may satisfy the requirements we have from the environmental managerial perspective. So these elements should be considered and cross-referenced. We need a training package for new employees entering the companies because we would have to align them. And we need to have a procedure where we, on an annual basis, for example, review the existing qualifications, identify potentially existing gaps and training needs, and build this into a training plan. For internal communication about all these aspects, about the importance of environmental management, about the relevance of procedures, about the personal roles of people involved, we need to have a procedure to control the internal communication about the various levels and functions and how different pieces of information are passed on and received. Simple measure would be regular meetings. Another measure can be a SharePoint platform on the company server, just to name a few examples. In defining these procedures, we should find means and measures which are familiar to the company we are talking to. Not to invent too many new things, but to use existing channels of information. Now, a mental exercise doesn't work so nice via the internet, but I think it's still possible to convey the message. My question to you, if we are a bigger company with 1,000 employees, how long will it take to inform all our 1,000 employees about the environmental policy? Assuming that today I inform 2 people, 2 representatives of the company, and tomorrow these 2 go out into their departments and each of them talks to 2 more people. Assuming an information chain like this, how long will it take to inform all the 1,000 employees of our enterprise? Usually at this point, people get disappointed, desperate, and say, well, it takes forever. It's impossible to talk to 1,000 people. But is it really? If we do our math on day 1, I would inform 2 people. Day 2, this would be 4, additionally to the 2 already informed. And if we follow these arithmetics, we will see that even before day 10, we have reached out to all of our 1,000 employees. And in our enterprise, we definitely will have much better instruments than simply talking to 2 people in person. We will have other ways of reaching out to our employees. So this internal communication is not only important, but it's also possible. It just needs some planning and some organization. And this is what the procedure on internal communication needs to do. It must be clear how internally communication is organized, relevant for the environmental management system, so the key elements starting from the policy, responsibilities, how this information is passed on within the company. And of course, there needs to be a mechanism how we react to changes. If an environmental policy is amended, the word must be spread out about the changes. The goals is information. We want everybody to know about the policy and the related objectives. We want to have continuous information about the actual performance, so whether there are any gaps, whether there are results to mobilize, or whether everything is following a green line. There should be also a mechanism to collect feedback, to collect ideas of our employees. This is important. These examples, I think I have already touched. So the result of all these considerations will be a communication plan, basically a table, a program, which collects the key elements, how communication, or what communication will be transmitted, how, to whom, when, and who is in charge of this communication. So environmental policy. There are regular updates every 3 months, and this works via the green board of the company. The new policy is put there, and additionally in the monthly meetings of department heads, this is addressed, and the department heads then alert their people. This could be such an element of a communication plan. Yes, this will have to include, as already mentioned, briefing program for new employees. This will have to include the environmental policy. This will include regular departmental and team meetings for constant repetition of the information to facilitate learning. This will also include company publications. Maybe in the annual business report, there can be a reference to environmental management. There might be some reward programs like the best green idea of the month, or the employee of the month, where environment might be one of the criteria in this selection. And of course, nowadays, a lot of this information exchange will be done based on computer systems, ideally based on existing ones. Likewise, mirrored information needs to be transmitted to the outside of the company. And again, we have the same procedure. Yesterday, we have identified our stakeholders. We have defined how we want to communicate with them. Now, here in this procedure, we will put a plan how we regularly transmit information to the interested parties outside.
The following elements are complementing the elements from the morning session, and together they form most of the environmental management system. Of course, all this needs to be adapted to the use of their to the scope of their operations and to the actual extent of environmental aspects, but basically, systematically, these are the elements. We will now be talking about operational planning and control, which means basically to control all the operations in the company which have a significant environmental impact according to our evaluation. We will also talk about emergency preparedness, because we remember that we have to deal with normal situations, so business as usual, regular operations, but also abnormal situations, which basically means emergency, fire, accidents, and so on, which might have an environmental impact. We will talk about performance evaluation, because we need to establish a dashboard, how we can monitor our progress in continuous improvement. And we will talk about this mechanism of internal auditing, of self-checking our organization, and a management review. Let me jump into details. This first part is dedicated to operational planning and control, which means that the organization must have processes to establish operating criteria for processes with an environmental impact, and the organization implement control of these processes. What does control of processes mean? Let's take as an example the roasting of the cocoa beans. What is the environmental aspect? The environmental aspect is that this process in drying uses energy, which is likely to release pollutants. The impact is the environmental pollution, and the control of the process which is required means that we conduct the roasting in a way that we minimize environmental impact. That means that operations is done only when there is load, so that there is no idle running, that the burners are set correctly, that no excess of heat is used, that temperatures are controlled. So that this process is controlled, that everybody involved in the process knows what to do to minimize environmental impact. So this means this sort of planning and procedures we need. If we think about our scheme from yesterday, we need at least for all red areas where we do have significant environmental aspects, and it's advisable that we also keep such features, the yellow areas, which might have an environmental impact in the end. All these, what I just discussed, should be consistent with the life cycle perspective. So ideally, we should include in the analysis the raw materials which we used, the use phase of the products we produce, and the end of life phase. Mr. Zotter practically is leading the way in terms of ISO 14000. As such, he involves his suppliers and discusses with them environmental impact of the resources he's using by familiarizing themselves with organic farming. With these, he's establishing a procedure for the early phase of the life cycle, which is raw material processing. Now, as I started talking, abnormal operational conditions which might happen and which will have an environmental impact are also to be considered by us, which means emergency preparedness. This means we need to have procedures to prevent and mitigate environmental impact from emergency situations, which might be fire, which might be breakage of pipes, accidentally releasing any contaminated water or solvents or so to the environment, just to give two examples. The procedures must regulate, must control the response to this situation. So it must regulate who is to be informed, what will be the first responders inside the company, what will they do? Do they have measures to fight the fire, like fire extinguishers? Do they have means to collect any spills and so on? Just to take, just to name a few examples. These response actions need to be tested, and their effectiveness needs to be reviewed regularly. So the main focus or the most widespread application of these emergency preparedness is action on fires. And you see a brief information leaflet on the right-hand side of this slide, which might be used in a company, which is first response measures in case of a fire. And this must be available also as a procedure which must be known to employees and which should be tested every now and then. So alarm, evacuation routines, first measures in firefighting, and so on, actually should be subject to regular drills to prevent any environmental impact from such situations. This was operational planning basically and emergency preparedness. We have our environmental management system now defined and in place and trained. Now, after a while, maybe 5-6 months of operation of the system, it needs to be checked, because things will have changed, gaps will have surfaced, practical implementation problems will appear. So we need to check the system which we have created for potential improvement. And the procedure for checking is an internal audit. And in these next few slides, we will discuss how to plan an environmental audit, who is part of the environmental audit, how an environmental audit is conducted, and how it is documented. This checking actually has the following elements. At first, or the highest level of checking is to establish sort of a dashboard, to have indicators on the basis of periodic measurements, of monitoring, of evaluation, showing whether we are on track. This would include, like Oleksi has presented, actual results from measurements regarding, for example, the boiler exhaust gases, could be measurements of the wastewater discharge, could be indicators like Anna presented yesterday in presenting the input-output analysis, where we see growing consumption of water or energy per production. All these would be instruments how to monitor, how to follow up, how to evaluate environmental aspects. All these indicators could show us in the form of a dashboard whether we are on the right way, whether our environmental impact is being reduced or whether it's not. The evaluation of this monitoring should lead to corrective action where required. So ideally, as soon as the exhaust gas temperature of the boiler increases or the water consumption increases, we should be alerted by our numbers, and we should start corrective action. And whether this process works or not should be identified in the internal audits, because it will happen that something breaks, that something is not working as it should be. But the mechanism how we identify these and the mechanism how we act is part of our environmental management system. And during the audit, we see whether this has worked or not. Working towards that, this is a very simple implementation of what we just discussed. What do we see here? Basically, it's the measurement of daily water consumption in a brewery in Colombia. And what they did was that at the end of every day, the foreman would record from the water meter what is the water consumption, would relate it to production, and would add a point in this chart. and this chart was posted in the meeting room, where in the next morning all the masters would meet to discuss the day. And in front of the other people, the environmental manager would put small stickers on top of this table. In green, if the consumption was in the expected range, and in red, if it was too high. So that clearly this daily evaluation of water consumption was demonstrated as something important to the masters, and that any deviations from the plan would become visible basically in real time the very next day. So this is just an example of monitoring environmental impacts. In this case, by measuring water consumption, documenting it, analyzing it. I'm sure that for the companies we are working with, we can find other indicators. Could be electricity consumption per production unit, could be fuel consumption, whatever our relevant environmental aspects are. Now, what is the point of this exercise? What is the point of evaluating actual performance? I'm using this example from sports, which I used to do when I was much younger than today. In kayaking, you learn that it's very important to look where you're going, because you will be going where you're looking. If you look at the main flow of the water, you will stay with the main flow of the water, whereas if you start looking at rocks or so, you will end up there. So it's important to have, now taking the analogy of environmental management, it's important to have a clear vision of the goals, and we have to have an instrument how to monitor whether we are approaching the goals or not. Now, the internal analysis of all these procedures and of their effectiveness and actual implementation is done in the internal audit. Internal audit means listening into the organization whether the procedures are working as they are planned. And by doing internal audits, we confirm whether our organization complies with its own requirements as documented in the environmental management manual and in the procedures. And on the other side, whether we are complying with the requirements of the standard wherever we go for a formal, proper certification. Basically in an audit, we check whether all the procedures, instructions are effectively implemented, maintained, and basically whether they are working. For this, we need an audit program. So we need to establish in advance which areas will be audited, at what time, by whom, using which methods. In this audit plan, we define audit criteria and the scope of each audit. We assign auditors, which are objective, who also understand what's going on in the respective area, and which are impartial, organizationally separate of the process to avoid any conflict of interest. And in the end of the audit, there needs to be a report which is transmitted to management. What would be criteria used in asking questions in the internal audit? When checking a procedure, we could use the following three ratings. Either something is not fulfilled because actually on the floor nothing is implemented of what is actually our procedure, and there is no documentation at all, then this is clearly not fulfilled. Could be partly fulfilled if a procedure is there in the manual or in the set of procedures, but there are no clues that it's actually implemented. There are no records. There are no documents proving that we are actually working according to this procedure. Then it's partly fulfilled, and it's fully fulfilled if people in the area know their procedures, act according to the procedures, and document this also, so that records are kept, that checks are done, checklists are filled in, documentation is kept of in relation to the procedures. For the implementation of the internal audit, definitely a checklist should be used to make sure we cover all the relevant aspects. Two checklists we put on the SharePoint. These checklists contain, one is just a PDF, the other one is a more sophisticated Excel worksheet, which also gives you some graphical interpretation then of the audit results. These checklists can be a good mental guideline to which questions you use when auditing a respective area. So we are basically through. We have our environmental impacts, we have the appropriate organization, we have developed all the procedural elements and so on. We have checked their working and their performance in an internal audit. Now there are two more steps to go. One is the management review, which basically is an overall assessment of the efficiency and effectiveness of the system, so that we report back to management. Well, you committed to an environmental management system. This is implemented now. It's acting according to the procedures, and it's effective as our environmental impact is being reduced. This would be a summary of a management review, or the management review would indicate areas to improve the management system in the future. And after having reported to management and having initiated conclusions about the overall system, there can be, where required, an external audit, where an external auditor like Sergei, as a representative of an auditing body, would come into the company and basically repeat the internal audit, and then issue a certificate if no non-conformances have been found in your system, comparing it towards the requirements of the ISO 14000 standard. Management review, just in a nutshell, out of these, the top management gets information about the actual functioning of the management system and recommended changes for improvement, if applicable. And in this review, a statement should be included regarding the policy, whether it fits the organization, whether it's up to date, regarding the environmental objectives and targets. Basically, in a nutshell, evaluating whether the environmental impact assessment was considering all relevant areas of the company and whether the objectives and targets which have been derived are sound and reasonable. The review further should refer to the audit results, what was found internally, and should suggest in the end corrective actions. So this management review concludes the full plan to check act cycle. It's the final evaluation and prepares the starting of a new cycle. Yeah, the process we have discussed. Non-conformity now, because you will remember this chart where we said continuous measuring, assessing of environmental impact, monitoring as a basis. There might be the case that this monitoring shows that we are not conforming with our standards, with our objectives, with our targets. This requires us to take action. If there is a non-conformity, we need to do something about it. And also this procedure needs to be controlled. This needs to be planned. And the non-conformity and corrective action basically defines what happens in the case of a non-conformity. It defines how we react towards this non-conformity, who reports it, who decides upon actions, who decides upon consequences. So basically it defines what happens in case monitoring shows that we are not conforming. Who should identify this? Probably it's operators, probably it's members of the environmental team. And then this procedure regulates to whom this is reported, probably towards the environmental manager or the management of the company. And the procedure also defines what happens then, because usually there needs to be a corrective action, which needs to be defined according to the non-conformity. If we are violating legal obligations, corresponding action needs to be taken. If we are violating our own procedures, corresponding action needs to be taken. So in case we exceed our wastewater threshold values, probably we need to get back to production. We need to investigate what was the problem, and we maybe need to change cleaning procedure, need to create additional awareness amongst the operators, or maybe improve automatic control of the process, just to give one example. But the key message of this section is, in case there is non-conformity, there must be a plan what should happen. So all in all, we are back to one of the initial slides. This management system shall support continuous improvement. So by continuously running through this plan to check act cycle, the management system should act like a wedge, keeping the organization on an ever higher level of performance by learning, by adapting to changes, by controlling the environmental impact of their processes better and better. Now, just as a brief summary, these are some observations now from numerous implementation of management systems. How long these activities which we have discussed during the last 2 days can last. And of course, this needs to be elaborated for the individual case, for the specific characteristics of the individual companies. But this can maybe serve as rules of the thumb, which periods to expect. This first stage of getting management commitment, according to our experience, takes around 2 weeks. Although I have to admit this is the minimum duration. Just talking to people, formulating a proposal, presenting the proposal, getting buying in. We have some examples where this took much longer, but I'm not elaborating on this here. Then project design, a proper plan of activities following maybe the model which we proposed in this presentation will take another 2 weeks. Then meetings, definition of responsibilities, collecting an environmental team will last anything between 2 to 4 weeks. Then we have the plan phase, the environmental policy, another 2 to 4 weeks, stakeholder analysis. This is the focus of 1 or 2 meetings with the team, another 2 weeks. Identification of compliance obligations, at least another 2 weeks, unless you are in the good situation like Volga that you have this already compiled. Identification of environmental aspects and objectives, each another 2 to 4 weeks. Then the development of the documentation. This is now assuming that we go for a slim manual and maybe 10, 12 procedures will take around a month. Working on instructions might take another one. And then implementing, including training, communicating internally, probably at least 2 months more. Installing monitoring measurement, at least another month, and then the internal audit and a management review, another 2 weeks. So we end up with serious work. For Zota, it took a little bit more than 8 months. For a bigger company, it probably takes a little bit more even. There is nothing magic in all these activities, but each of them needs to be done properly, documented properly, and put together into a integrated, synergistic system. And this, according to our experience, unfortunately, takes some time and effort. But just as a rule of the thumb, to know what to expect. So, summarizing before we do the last round of exercises, has become clearer, if it was not already understood, that the environmental management system is basically a set of processes which enable an organization to reduce the environmental impacts resulting of the environmental aspects. And basically, it's about an organized set of procedures to increase operating efficiency. The high-level structure, the basic in the system, is this plan, do, check, act cycle. At first, we have to understand our environmental impacts. Then we then we establish procedures accordingly. This set of manual procedures, instructions. We check the efficiency and effectiveness of these procedures in the audit cycle, and then we improve, we act accordingly. Steps we have discussed. First, commitment to environmental policy. Then this policy is the basis for establishing a plan. composed out of objectives and targets to improve environmental performance, and these should be applied continuously